All right, so let's go ahead. Tonight, we're going to just do one of Brother Gatz preaching to us tonight. I'm working on finding a series, and the one I was looking at, I didn't get to finish it, so we'll go ahead and work on this one, and then we'll see if we can get into a series that I found. So let's go ahead and get started.
I appreciate how the music this morning has lifted up that name of the Lord Jesus Christ. And his name is worthy to be lifted up. And today we're going to look at a prayer in the Bible. If you'll turn to 1 Samuel chapter 2, and this prayer certainly is focused on the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. It's focused on the name of God. And we want to continue that in our hearts this morning as we look at 1 Samuel chapter 2. This is a prayer of a woman by the name of Hannah. And it's a beautiful prayer, but it's a powerful prayer, and one that we can learn much from. 1 Samuel chapter 2, I'll read starting in verse 1. And Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoiceth in the Lord. Mine horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth is enlarged over mine enemies, because I rejoice in thy salvation. There is none holy as the Lord, for there is none beside thee, neither is there any rock like our God. Talk no more so exceeding proudly. Let not arrogancy come out of your mouth. For the Lord is the God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty men are broken, and they that stumbled are girded with strength. They that were full have hired out themselves for bread, and they that were hungry ceased. So that the barren hath borne 7, and she that hath many children is waxed feeble. The Lord killeth and maketh alive. He bringeth down to the grave and bringeth up again. The Lord maketh poor and maketh rich. He bringeth low and lifteth up. He raiseth up the poor out of the dust and lifteth up the beggar from the dunghill, to set them among the princes, and to make them inherit the throne of glory. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he hath set the world upon them. He will keep the feet of his saints, and the wicked shall be silent in darkness, for by strength shall no man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Out of heaven shall he thunder upon them. The Lord shall judge the ends of the earth, and he shall give strength unto his king, and exalt the horn of his anointed." No matter how many centuries go by, God has no rival. We often speak in the sports world of the GOAT, the greatest of all time. As a kid growing up watching basketball, Bill Russell was the GOAT. Bill Russell was the best there ever was, and ever going to be. I mean, how can you argue with 11 world championships? But most of you don't even know who Bill Russell is. He was given that title, the GOAT, the greatest of all time, but others have come along and challenged that spot. We hardly remember Tom Brady anymore. He's going to have to play football again when he's 60 to reclaim that GOAT title. But you know, while we judge athletes in their best moments, you'll come to know God in the worst of them. Hannah had no child. She was barren. And in the Old Testament, when a woman could not bear a child, they perceived that to be some sort of dismay or judgment by God upon their life. They believed that for some reason God was withholding this blessing from them. And so a woman without child would often search her heart. She would cry out to God, "Lord, why? Why am I without a child? Is there something I need to get right? Is there something that you're doing here that I don't understand?" And such was the condition of Hannah in chapter 1. As we read that chapter, we come to verses 5 through 10, where she's crying out in bitterness to the Lord. "Lord, why haven't you given me that which I desire? Why haven't you allowed me to fulfill that purpose for which you made me? to multiply and replenish the earth. In verse 11 of chapter 1, she vows a vow to God. She says, God, if you'll give me a child, I promise that I will give him back to you. I will return him to you in service for you. And she says, God, just allow me the privilege, give me the blessing of being a mom, and I'll give that son back to you. In verses 12 through 17 of chapter 1, she prays, and Eli listens to her prayer, and he thinks she's actually drunk as she cries out to the Lord, as her heart yearns for God to work in her life. And we find in verse 20 of chapter 1 that God answers this prayer, and he provides for her a son. And in the closing verses of chapter 1, she gives this boy Samuel back to the Lord. She fulfills that vow that she made as she promised she would do. In chapter 2, our text is a prayer that's born out of anxiety, out of anguish, out of abandonment, and out of an answer to prayer. What are you learning about God? What did you learn this week about God? You'll learn about God in your worst moments. Maybe you're going through a difficult time. Maybe you're facing some adversity in your life. You may even wonder, is God even here? Does God even exist? Is there a possibility perhaps that all of these things in the Bible and religion are just kind of an emotional high that people get on, and all of this is perhaps for naught? Perhaps you're going through that difficult valley in your life. But I want you to see 3 liberating lessons that Hannah learned about God in the worst of times. We find that she learned that nothing compares to God. In verse 1, she prayed and said, my heart rejoiceth in the Lord. Mine horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth is enlarged over mine enemies, because I rejoice in thy salvation. There is none holy as the Lord, for there is none beside thee. Neither is there any rock like our God. We live in a world today where people claim to have a certain level of power. Our political leaders, those around the world today, would claim to sit on thrones or sit in seats of power today. We have wealthy people who, because of their wealth, seem to believe that they have power. We have people on the internet and social media who have people that follow them, and as a result are called influencers, and they feel a certain power because people listen to what they say. There are people certainly with a level of power. The first time I preached in Hawaii, I was there by myself, and one night some of the Marines in the church, they said, Brother Getch, let's go play some racquetball. I said, okay. It was about 9 o'clock at night, and I was a little tired from the day, but you know, these guys, they just have batteries that don't stop, and they're Marines, you know, and you don't tell a Marine no. And so they said, let's go play some racquetball. We went up on the base, and they had some racquetball courts, and we played racquetball. And I mean, these guys were very competitive, and they're going all at it, and we're switching around and playing different guys, and we played for 3 hours racquetball. I mean, at midnight, these guys were finally talking about maybe going to bed. And we're walking out of the racquetball court area, and one of the men who seemed to be a little bit older, he said, Brother Getch, let's go for a jog. I said, go for a jog? It's midnight. He said, yeah, but we got plenty of time to sleep. Let's go for a jog. So we started jogging around that Marine base. And as we did, I said, you have been in the military for a while? He told me how many years, and he was a certain rank that I didn't really understand completely. And I said, well, what do you actually do? I mean, what is your job? I mean, what do you do when you're on job? And he said, I control all of the nuclear weapons in the South Pacific. Wow. I'm glad I'm with you. You know, there are certain people in this world that have a level of power, but nothing compares to God. Nothing compares to the purity of God. If you see there in verse number 2, there is none holy as the Lord. No matter how hard you and I try this week, we're going to mess up. We might determine in our mind, I'm not going to sin this week. I'm not going to get angry. I'm not going to get frustrated. I'm not going to have a wrong thought. I'm going to try to do right. I'm going to be kind. I'm going to love people. And we can go into this week thinking, I'm going to master myself, and I'm going to master situations, and I'm going to be able to live this whole week without sinning one time. But before you start, you're not going to make it. But nothing compares to the purity of God. He is the rock. His work is perfect. All his ways are judgment, a God of truth and without iniquity, just and right is he. The psalmist said, exalt the Lord our God and worship at his holy hill, for the Lord our God is holy. In Isaiah 6, as Isaiah gets the glimpse of that throne room of God, and he sees those seraphims, those angelic beings with the 6 wings, with twain they covered their face, and with twain they covered their feet, and with twain they did fly, and one cried unto another, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The Revelator John in chapter 15 and verse 4 said, who shall not fear thee, O Lord, and glorify thy name, for thou only art holy. Nothing compares to the purity of God. They didn't crucify Jesus because he was wrong. They crucified him because he was right. In him is no sin. He had done no violence, neither was any deceit found in his mouth. Peter said he was a lamb slain without spot, without blemish. He was tempted in all points like as we, and yet without sin. Nothing compares to the purity of God. But we see also in verse 2 that nothing compares to the permanence of God. The Bible says there is none beside thee, neither is there any rock like our God. A rock is kind of symbolic of permanence, is it not? Rocks just don't move. They certainly don't move on their own. There's something about a rock, especially a large rock, that gives the idea of permanence. When I was a sophomore in college, I spent an internship one summer at a church in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And during that summer, we took a group of teenagers with us up into Canada to a camp out in the middle of absolutely nowhere. And we had a work camp. This camp was just kind of getting started. They were trying to build some buildings and clear some brush. And we went up there with these teens to try to help them get this camp established, primarily to reach some of the Indian children in that area of Canada. We drove up there, and of course, we were going to have services at night to challenge our own hearts. And we had brought in a youth pastor from Illinois to preach to us. And boy, one night there as a 19-year-old kid, I'm a college student, but I'm listening to this preaching, and I'm in a place there where there's no influence from the world, and God is working in my heart. And I remember the next morning, there was a large lake that the camp was located on. And near the campsite, there was a small peninsula that went out. It was just kind of a little finger of ground into the lake. It went out, and at the very end of that little peninsula was a huge rock. And I walked out there to that rock, and it was there that I opened my Bible, and I just began to spend some time with the Lord, reading His Word and trying to pray. And it was at that rock that morning that God called me to preach. I didn't tell anybody for 6 months because I wanted God to show me over and over again that that's what He wanted in my life. I knew that a call to preach was not something to be taken lightly. It was not something to do just because maybe I wanted to do it. And so I didn't tell anybody. I didn't go forward in a service. I didn't sign a card or anything saying that I was called to preach. But it was at that rock that morning that God had taken the preaching that I'd been hearing and the thoughts in my heart, and using His Word, He showed me that this was the direction for my life. And I don't tell that story a lot, but recently I was telling it in a meeting, and I don't remember exactly what I was trying to illustrate about this, the sermon, but I told that story about going out to that rock, and it was there that God called me to preach. This was in 1973. That's a ways back there. And after the service, this young couple came running up to me. They said, Brother Getch, we've been to that rock. We've been to that rock. I said, what rock? The one in Canada, they said. We've been at that camp. We've been out on that peninsula. We've been to that rock. In fact, that's where my husband proposed to me. I said, the rock's still there? Oh, yeah, it's still there. There's something permanent about a rock, isn't there? Our God is a rock. Nothing compares to the permanence of God. I am the Lord, I change not. Everything in this world is changing faster than we can even imagine it. And yet God remains the same yesterday, today, and forever. Of old hast thou laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of thy hands. As a vesture shalt thou change them, and they shall be changed. But thou art the same, and thy years shall have no end. Don't you think it would be wise to base your eternity on someone who's eternal? Don't you think that you ought to give some thought to eternity based on the one who is eternal and what He has said to us in His Word? Whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and keepeth them, I'll liken him unto a man who built his foundation upon a rock. The rains descended, the winds came and blew, but the house on the rock stood. Why? Because it was founded on the rock, founded on God Himself. Other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ. We are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ, the chief cornerstone. This past week, preaching up in Colorado, there were a group of teenagers at the camp who, they weren't all from the same church, but they were all struggling with the same thing. And through the first several days, I had conversations with a number of these kids, and they were really struggling with this matter of eternal security. They agreed with the preaching as far as how you get saved, but they weren't sure that you could know that you were saved. They just felt like, well, what if I mess up? Or what if something bad happens and I don't go to church anymore? Or what if I were to commit suicide, they said? Am I still saved? And they were really battling with this matter of eternal security. And I kept taking them back to an eternal God who said, I give unto them eternal life, and they shall never perish. Neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. The Father that gave them me is greater than all, and no man's able to pluck them out of my Father's hand. And you know what a joy it was last night around the campfire there up on that mountain at 8,500 feet, listening to those teenagers go around there and say, you know what, this week I found out that I'm saved forever because God's eternal. I can't lose my salvation. I have that settled. I'm going to heaven when I die. Listen, you need to base your eternity on the one who is eternal. Nothing compares to God. Nothing compares to His purity, to His permanence. But notice, secondly, Hannah learns that nothing is concealed from God. In verses 3 through 8, Hannah goes through quite a bevy of words with respect to God. And in this description that she makes of God in comparison to man, she points out the omniscience of God. The omniscience of God. That God is all-knowing. God knows everything. In verse 3, she begins this section by saying here in verse number 3, she says, talk no more so exceeding proudly, let not arrogancy go out of your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge. There is nothing that God does not know. I had a young man tell me one time, he said, Mr. Gatch, I always sin by myself. It's just one of the rules I have about sin. I always sin by myself. That way nobody can rat on me. I said, young man, you've never sinned by yourself. God's been there every single time. Thou set our iniquities before thee, our secret sins are in the light of thy countenance. Oh God, thou knowest my foolishness. My secret sins are not hid from thee. If we have forgotten the name of our God or stretched out our hands to a strange God, will not God search this out? For he knoweth the secrets of the heart. There's nothing covered, Jesus said in Luke chapter 12, that shall not be made known. There's nothing hid that shall not be made known. Whatsoever you've spoken in darkness shall be heard in the light. That which you have spoken in the ear and closets shall be proclaimed from the housetops. Why? Because neither is there any creature that's not manifested in his sight, but all things are open and naked on the eyes of him with whom we have to do. You didn't do anything this week that God didn't see. You didn't even think anything this week God didn't know. For Ezekiel 11:5 says, I know the things that come into your mind, every one of them. You didn't have an attitude this week. I didn't have a desire this week. We didn't have anything go through our brain that God does not know. And yet we think we can hide from God. We think that we can deceive God. We can pull the wool over God's eyes. Can any hide himself in secret places that I shall not see him? Do not I fill the heavens and the earth? Whither shall I go from thy spirit? Whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the darkness shall be light about me. The darkness hideth not from thee. The darkness and the light are both alike unto thee. Nothing gets by God. Nothing compares to his omniscience. Listen, you don't have a problem. You don't have a need. You don't have a burden this morning that God doesn't know. God will attend every funeral of every bird that dies today. Are ye not much better than sparrows? He asks. There's nothing that God isn't aware of that's going on in your life. There's no heartbreak. There's no sorrow. There's no burden that God is not aware of. Hannah learns about the omniscience of God, but notice also she learns about the objectivity of God. In verse 4, she says, the bows of the mighty are broken, and they that stumbled are girded with strength. They that were full have hired out themselves for bread, and they that were hungry ceased. So the barren hath borne 7, and she that hath many children is waxed feeble. The Lord killeth and maketh alive. He bringeth down to the grave and bringeth up. The Lord maketh poor and maketh rich. He bringeth low and lifteth up. He raiseth up the poor out of the dust and lifteth up the beggar from the dunghill to set them among princes and to make them inherit the throne of glory. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's. He has set the world upon them. There are no bribes with God. There are no deals made with God. There's no cover-ups with God. David was a man after God's own heart. but he didn't get to cut a deal with God about his sin. Moses, God says about him in Deuteronomy 34, there was not a prophet like Moses before or since. But Moses didn't get to go into the promised land because there's no deals. There's no bribes. There's no cover-ups. There's no agreement on the side, well, you're going to let me do this and I'll still get to do this. No, Hannah learns about God's objectivity. Be not deceived, God's not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. If a man sow to the flesh, he shall of the flesh reap corruption. And he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. God's going to bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. So Hannah has learned that nothing compares to God's purity, to his permanence. She has learned that nothing is concealed from God's omniscience or his objectivity. But notice, thirdly, she learns that nothing continues without God. You know, we tend to think that we're in control. We tend to think, I got this. I can manage my life. I can manage my situation. I can take care of this. I know how to deal with this. But notice Hannah reveals the sovereignty of God. In verse 4, she talks about the mighty men and their bows being broken. She talks about those that have plenty to eat are suddenly without food. Those who have many children are suddenly barren, and those that were barren now have children. She talks about how those that are high on earth are brought low, and low on earth are made high. There's a sovereignty to God. A man deviseth his way, but the Lord directeth his steps. In Jeremiah chapter 10, O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. The sovereignty of God. I find great comfort today in the day in which we live in Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 8. If thou seest the oppression of the poor and the violent perverting of judgment and justice in the province, marvel not at the matter. For he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be that are higher than they. Those who laugh in the face of God this morning, those who mock God, they're not the highest. They're not in control. Those who run governments by dictatorship and authoritarianism, they're not in control. Those with the money who can donate to campaigns or causes and think that I can control, I can make society this way, they're not in control. Those who pervert judgment and justice, those who fix things in the court system, they're not in control. We're not in control. He is. She learns the sovereignty of God, but she also learns the superiority of God. In verse 9, she says, He will keep the feet of his saints, and the wicked shall be silent in darkness, for by strength shall no man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Out of heaven shall he thunder upon them. The Lord shall judge the ends of the earth. He shall give strength unto his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Job said, I know it is so the truth. But how can a man be just with God? If he contend with him, he cannot answer him 1 in 1,000. Who hath hardened himself against him and hath prospered? Which removeth the mountains, and they know not, which overturneth them in his anger, which shaketh the earth out of her place, and the pillars thereof tremble, which calleth Arcturus and Orion and Pleiades, and the chambers of the south, which doeth great things past finding out, yea, and wonders without number. So how long, ye simple ones, will ye love simplicity? And the scorners delight in their scorning. And fools hate knowledge. Turn you at my reproof. I'll pour out my spirit unto you. I'll make known my words unto you, because I've called, but you refused. I stretched out my arm, but no man regarded. You've set at naught all my counsel. You would none of my reproof. I also will laugh at your calamity. I'll mock when your fear cometh. When your fear cometh as a desolation. When your destruction cometh as a whirlwind. When distress and anguish cometh upon you, then shall they call upon me, but I'll not answer. They shall seek me early, but they shall not find me, because they did not choose the fear of the Lord. What are you choosing today? What do you know about God? Have you put your trust in him? Voltaire was a famous atheist. Like many today, he did not believe there was such a thing as God. He went everywhere speaking of his atheism, as many do today. Voltaire claimed that within 100 years of his death, there would not be a single Bible left on the earth. That he and his organization of atheism would destroy every semblance of God, including the Bible. But according to a book by Herbert Lockyer called Last Words of Saints and Sinners, the deathbed words of people, Mr. Voltaire, on his deathbed, turned to his doctor, Dr. Trotcham, who had attended to him as his life began to wane. He looked at his medical doctor and he said, I will give you half of everything I am worth if you will give me 6 more months to live. Oh, Jesus Christ. Oh, Jesus Christ. He died cursing the God he said never existed. My friend, there is a God. Nothing compares to him. Nothing's concealed from him. And nothing continues without him. It would be wise for us to trust our future, to trust our eternity in the hands of the one who is indeed eternal.